Good day, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Safari Mack Explores Australia. I'm Safari Mack, your guide and host, helping you make connections to the wild. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're back in the outback. Yep, we have left behind the platypus back in southeastern Australia or New South Wales, and we are, in a way, right smack dab back in the middle. Because today we're going to meet up with a creature that seems to, as I would like to call, have been shrouded in mystery ever since the European explorers came to Australia, and even in today's standards of biologists. Today we meet the dingo, otherwise known by their Latin name of Canis lupus dingo. So if you're ready to go hunting, we're going to set off with these guys. But before we begin, if you're new to my channel, hit that like and subscribe button. Check out my Facebook page for content on conservation. And if you have a question about animals, or if there's an animal you want me to do in the future, you just have to send me an email, which you will always find the link to down in my description below. But if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's get started. Now, when it comes to family and evolution, this creature really is unusual of Australia because, believe it or not, the dingo originally is not an Australian native. If there's one thing that we have gone through so far on our trip through Australia in terms of mammals, like the kangaroo, the koala, and even our latest animal, the platypus, none of these animals, in a way, give birth to young as most animals do. In fact, in a way, the dingo is considered to be the first true original placental mammal, meaning they give birth, right? They just automatically give birth. They don't have a pouch, they don't lay eggs, they just are they're like your typical dog. So that's right. The dingo is not an Australian native. If anything, they are thought to have actually been introduced to Australia roughly around 4,000 years ago by Asian seafaring adventurers that crossed over the oceans and managed to land in the land down under, bringing with them their dogs. In fact, it's thought that these animals are actually more closely related, or maybe descended, from New Guinea's singing dogs and even domesticated dogs. So in a way, some people want to think that these animals are in a way a kind of feral dog, or in other words, a dog that which a species or breed once used to be under the care of humanity, but has since managed to return back to its original roots, somewhat like that of a wolf. But now, make no mistake, despite it being not a native to Australia, the fact that it was introduced well over 4,000 years ago, perhaps even longer, we can easily say that this is one of Australia's top predators in terms of mammals. That is, of course, if humans never lived on the continent. Now, let's go into their habitat, lifestyle, and their reproduction. Now, of course, amazingly, dingoes are highly adaptable animals. And it only makes sense because that's what basically most dog breeds are, or most dog species. Whether wolf, fox, coyote, either way, these animals are highly adaptable. They can live anywhere from the desert regions, the dry grass areas, where they would prefer to be in near wooded areas that have, like, on the edge of it, there's a big grassy plain. But they can also survive along the coastal regions, even the rainforest districts of Australia. So make no mistake, just because you see one in the outback doesn't mean that it's not going to be able to find its way. They're even known to be found back with in the region of the platypus. So the alpine region, that's no stranger. Of course, though, as you can see here on this map, the darker color is more of where you would find them commonly, while the white they are there, but it's kind of rare. And then the white areas, forget it. You won't find them anywhere near that spot, at least never again. Like Tasmania, forget it. You won't ever see them there. But now back to their lifestyle. So these guys are basically, being dogs, they're somewhat of a social animal. But that's not to say that a dingo won't adopt a solitary lifestyle. However, most of these dingo packs will live in groups where there's a bunch of different members, including a dominant male and dominant female that rule over the pack and keep everybody in order and in check. And if anything, only the dominant male and the dominant female will ever breed, as the rest of the pack members have the responsibility of helping to look after the pups. So in a way, there is a king and a queen, and then there's the commoners, and so you get the point. You get the idea of the social structure of dogs, or wolves, of course. So it's pretty similar for dingoes. Of course, they'll produce at least one litter per season, per breeding season, in which anywhere from 2 to 4 pups will appear, and as I said, the rest of the pack has the responsibility of taking care of these pups up until they reach adulthood, which can be around 1 to 2 years of age. Now, let's talk about their diet as well as their hunting style. Now, being a pretty well successful predator, it's pretty hard to exactly figure out what they will eat. However, thanks to a 20-year study done on all across the land of Australia, we've been able to identify as many different forms of food. In fact, now this is going to seem sad, but this is just part of the science. Dingoes that were captured or killed were collected by ended up being in biology labs where their stomachs were examined, and they were able to find a number of different prey items. In fact, the study produced that these animals can feed on over 177 different species, which meant 72.3% include mammals, 18.8% birds, 3.3% vegetation, 3.8% of fish, insects, crabs, even amphibians were documented being eaten. So yeah, I bet you didn't know that the dingo could fish. Heck, you know what? It's kind of funny anyway, because you could imagine my face when I once saw a wolf actually managing to catch a fish up in Alaska, not in person, but on a documentary. So, not bad. And here's another cool thing about dingoes. So, despite being somewhat of a long-term invasive species, they're not the worst. They'll keep... Of course, they naturally will prey upon kangaroos or other Australian wildlife, but they're also known to help kill and eat some of the invasive animals that we've met so far during our travels, like the Asiatic water buffalo. We'll get to that, but we'll get to those creatures at a much later time. Finally, let's close out today's Part 1 episode with their influence in Australian culture. Now, the dingo actually holds a fairly significant place in the spirituality of many Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. They're often viewed as companions, ancestors, even spiritual beings. So they are featured mostly in Dreamtime stories or ceremonies, rituals, art, even songs have been composed in honor of the dingo. The dingo has even integrated a kind of kinship with the Aboriginals. In fact, they were thought to probably be the dogs that the early people brought with them when they first settled in Australia. Not the European explorers, but I mean like the ancients that first came to the land and developed their own custom, their culture, their way of life. And so the Aborigines used dingoes as guard dogs, protecting camps and people from potential threats. They've even provided some kind of a sense of security and protection, especially for the women and children. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that's all the time I have for today's Part 1 episode, but be sure to join me again next week for Part 2 of the dingo. But until that happens, this is Safari Mack, and I'll see you all out there.